handsome. You thought you were dealing with a helpless old lady.
A confident young man wakes up in a cold, windowless room, his wrists bound to a metal chair, his designer suit wrinkled and stained. The last thing Marcus Chan remembers is sharing an expensive bottle of wine with a charming 72-year-old widow in her oceanfront mansion. Now, federal agents are sliding photographs across the interrogation table, each one documenting crimes he thought he'd gotten away with years ago. But here's the twist that will leave you breathless. The sweet, lonely grandmother he targeted wasn't a victim at all. Eleanor Whitmore spent 35 years as one of the CIA's most decorated covert operatives, a master of deception who infiltrated Soviet intelligence networks and dismantled international crime syndicates. The same skills she used to outsmart foreign agents, she just used to dismantle a predator who thought elderly women were easy prey. This isn't just a story about a con artist getting caught. This is about calculated justice delivered by someone who spent decades in the shadows, someone who knows exactly how criminals think because she's hunted them across 3 continents. Marcus thought he was the hunter, carefully selecting his victim, studying her vulnerabilities, perfecting his approach. He had no idea he was walking straight into a trap set by a woman who had forgotten more about manipulation than he would ever learn. How did a 72-year-old retiree completely dismantle an experienced criminal's operation in a single evening? What happened in those missing hours before Marcus woke up in federal custody? And what drives a woman who earned her peaceful retirement to risk everything by going back into the field one last time? Stay with us, because the truth is far more shocking than you could possibly imagine. Marcus Chun stood on the terrace of the Rosewood Miramar Beach Resort in Montecito, California, scanning the crowd with practiced precision. At 34, he had transformed himself into exactly what wealthy, lonely women wanted to see. Handsome in an approachable way, well-dressed but not flashy, cultured enough to discuss art, or relatable enough to seem genuine. His tailored navy blazer and crisp white shirt projected success without arrogance. He'd spent 8 years perfecting his craft, and in that time, he'd never been caught. Not once. The charity gala for the Santa Barbara Museum of Art attracted exactly the demographic Marcus specialized in. Affluent women over 60, many of them widows, all of them desperate for companionship in a city where loneliness hid behind multi-million-dollar ocean views. He sipped his champagne slowly, watching, calculating, waiting for that perfect combination of wealth, vulnerability, and isolation. That's when he saw her. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the auction display, examining a vintage Cartier necklace with the kind of casual interest that suggested money was no object. She wore an elegant cream-colored dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her silver hair was styled in a sophisticated twist. But what caught Marcus's attention wasn't her obvious wealth or her refined appearance. It was the way she stood slightly apart from the other guests, observing rather than participating, present but somehow separate. Marcus had learned to read body language like most people read books. Eleanor's posture told him she was intelligent, independent, and most importantly, alone. No wedding ring, no companion hovering nearby, no group of friends claiming her attention. She was perfect. He'd done his research before attending the gala. Santa Barbara was a gold mine for his operation. The city's median home price exceeded $2 million, and its population skewed older and wealthier than almost anywhere else in California. It was a place where old money mixed with tech fortunes, where widows of Silicon Valley pioneers and Hollywood producers lived in splendid isolation behind gates and security systems that kept out physical threats, but did nothing to protect against emotional manipulation. Marcus approached Eleanor with the kind of confidence that came from years of success. He positioned himself next to her at the auction display, waited a few seconds, then spoke in a warm, slightly self-deprecating tone he'd perfected over countless encounters. "I have to admit, I can barely tell the difference between costume jewelry and the real thing," he said, gesturing at the Cartier piece. "But I'm pretty sure that's not something you'd find at a department store." Eleanor turned to him with a smile that reached her eyes, a kind of genuine warmth that immediately made people comfortable. "1920s Cartier," she said. "Art Deco period. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. See how the platinum setting allows the diamonds to catch light from multiple angles? They don't make them like this anymore." Marcus leaned in slightly, projecting fascination. "You have an incredible eye. Are you a collector?" "I appreciate beautiful things," Eleanor replied. "But I've learned that the stories behind objects are often more valuable than the objects themselves." This necklace belonged to a silent film actress who wore it to the first Academy Award ceremony. Can you imagine? She walked through those doors when Hollywood was still figuring out what it wanted to be. The conversation flowed naturally from there. Marcus deployed his carefully crafted backstory. He was a financial consultant who'd moved to Santa Barbara 3 years ago after burning out in San Francisco's tech industry. He talked about rediscovering what mattered in life, about the importance of slowing down and appreciating beauty. Every word was calculated to resonate with someone who'd likely spent decades in a fast-paced career and was now seeking meaning in retirement. Eleanor listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that suggested real curiosity rather than polite conversation. She told him she'd worked in government service for most of her career. Nothing glamorous, mostly administrative work that took her around the world. She'd retired 5 years ago, after her husband passed away, and now she split her time between her home in Montecito and traveling to places she'd never had time to properly explore during her working years. Marcus filed away every detail. Government pension meant steady income. International experience suggested sophistication and education. 5 years widowed meant she was past the initial grief, but still adjusting to life alone. The Montecito address confirmed serious wealth, and the way she spoke about travel with a hint of wistfulness suggested she was still searching for purpose and connection. He'd found his target. Over the next hour, Marcus worked his magic with the subtlety that came from years of practice. He made Eleanor laugh with a story about his disastrous attempt to learn sailing. He shared a carefully edited version of his own loss, a fictional fiancé who died in a car accident 3 years ago, leaving him understanding grief in a way most people his age couldn't. He touched her arm lightly when making a point, establishing physical connection without crossing boundaries. He listened more than he talked, a trick that made people feel valued and understood. When the gala began winding down, Marcus suggested they continue their conversation over coffee sometime. Eleanor agreed immediately, and they exchanged phone numbers. As Marcus walked to his leased BMW, he felt the familiar rush of a successful first contact. Eleanor Whitmore would be his biggest score yet. He could feel it. What Marcus didn't know was that Eleanor had already run his fingerprints through 3 different databases using a reader built into her vintage Cartier ring. She knew his real name was Marcus Jin Chun, that he'd been arrested twice for fraud in his 20s, but never convicted, and that at least 7 women in 3 states had filed police reports about him in the past 5 years. None of those cases had gone anywhere because Marcus was careful, always staying just on the legal side of romance scams, never stealing enough to trigger serious federal interest. Eleanor also knew something Marcus didn't. She wasn't just another wealthy widow. For 35 years, she'd been one of the CIA's most effective covert operatives, specializing in counterintelligence and infiltration. She'd tracked Soviet agents through Berlin, dismantled smuggling operations in Southeast Asia, and helped capture some of the most dangerous criminals in the world. Her administrative government work had included operations so classified that most of them would remain secret long after she died. She'd been fully retired for 5 years, enjoying her hard-earned peace. But 3 months ago, An old colleague from the bureau had contacted her with a proposition. They'd been tracking a network of sophisticated romance scammers targeting elderly victims, and they needed someone who could go undercover, someone the criminals would never suspect. When her friend mentioned that one of the recent victims had been Eleanor's college roommate, a woman who'd lost her entire retirement savings to a charming con artist, Eleanor had agreed immediately. Marcus Chun had been on their radar for months. They just needed evidence, and Eleanor was going to get it. As Eleanor drove home that night in her Mercedes, she replayed the evening's conversation in her mind, cataloging Marcus's techniques with professional appreciation. He was good, she had to admit. Better than most. His backstory was solid, his emotional manipulation sophisticated, his timing impeccable. He'd be a worthy opponent. But Marcus had made one critical mistake. He'd chosen to prey on someone who'd spent decades preying on people far more dangerous than him. The game was on, and Marcus had no idea he'd already lost. This story is just beginning, and what comes next will shock you. If you want to see how Eleanor turns the tables on this predator, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss a single moment. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what you think of Marcus's tactics so far, and share this video with someone who loves stories about justice being served. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when a professional con artist meets a professional spy. The next chapter reveals Marcus's meticulously planned seduction strategy and the first cracks that appear in his perfect plan. Marcus Chun prided himself on patience. Unlike amateur scammers who rushed their marks and triggered suspicion, he understood that the best cons were built on genuine-seeming relationships that developed naturally over weeks or months. The investment of time paid dividends in trust, and trust was the foundation of every successful operation. 3 days after the gala, he texted Eleanor with a casual invitation for coffee at a beachfront cafe in Butterfly Beach. She accepted enthusiastically, and their second meeting confirmed Marcus's initial assessment. Eleanor was intelligent, cultured, and deeply lonely. She talked about her late husband Robert with a mixture of fondness and sadness, describing their 42 years together and how strange it felt to suddenly be alone after building an entire life around partnership. Marcus listened with the practiced empathy that had served him so well over the years. He asked thoughtful questions about Robert's career as a diplomat, about the places they'd lived together, about the challenges of maintaining a relationship while traveling constantly. He shared his own fabricated memories of his dead fiancée, matching Eleanor's emotional vulnerability with his own carefully calibrated openness. Over the following 3 weeks, they fell into a comfortable pattern. Coffee twice a week, then dinner at increasingly upscale restaurants. Marcus always insisted on paying, a calculated investment that demonstrated his financial stability while making Eleanor feel valued. He sent thoughtful text messages at strategic intervals, never too frequently, always warm and interested. He remembered details she'd mentioned in passing and brought them up later, showing he paid attention and cared. Eleanor's Montecito estate was everything Marcus had hoped for and more. Set on 3 acres of meticulously landscaped grounds overlooking the Pacific Ocean, the modern Mediterranean-style mansion probably cost $15 million minimum. The security was impressive, high walls, cameras, an elaborate gate system. But Eleanor mentioned she'd had it all installed after Robert died because she felt vulnerable living alone in such a large property. Marcus filed that information away as confirmation of her psychological vulnerability. She was afraid, isolated, and desperate for someone who made her feel safe again. Perfect. During their 4th dinner, at an exclusive restaurant in the hills above Santa Barbara, Marcus began laying the groundwork for his financial play. He mentioned casually that he was considering a real estate investment in Santa Barbara's luxury market. Nothing definite, just exploring opportunities. He talked knowledgeably about property values, market trends, and investment strategies, positioning himself as financially savvy and successful. Eleanor seemed impressed. She mentioned that Robert had left her comfortable financially, but that she sometimes worried about managing her assets properly without his guidance. Marcus's pulse quickened. This was the opening he'd been waiting for. "You know," he said, reaching across the table to touch her hand gently, "I'd be happy to look over your portfolio sometime, if you'd like a second opinion. No pressure, of course. I just hate seeing people worry about money when they should be enjoying life." Eleanor squeezed his hand and smiled warmly. "That's incredibly kind of you, Marcus. I might take you up on that." But despite the apparent success of his campaign, small things about Eleanor bothered Marcus. Details that didn't quite fit the profile of a vulnerable, isolated widow. During one of their dinners, a waiter accidentally knocked over a glass near their table. Eleanor's reaction was almost supernaturally fast, her hand shooting out to catch the glass before it hit the ground, her body shifting into a balanced stance that suggested combat training. She'd laughed it off as reflexes from years of yoga, but Marcus had noticed the cold calculation in her eyes during that split second, a look that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Another time, when Marcus had arrived early to pick her up for dinner, he'd heard Eleanor speaking rapid German on the phone in her study. When she'd emerged, she'd explained it was a call with her travel agent about a trip to Munich, but the conversation he'd overheard had sounded far more intense than vacation planning. He spoke enough German from a college semester abroad to catch a few words: surveillance, confirmation, and asset. Then there was the issue of her house security. Marcus had expected standard high-end residential protection, cameras, motion sensors, maybe a panic button or two. But Eleanor's system was something else entirely. He'd noticed cameras positioned at angles that suggested military-level threat assessment. The windows were clearly bulletproof. And one evening, when Eleanor had excused herself to use the bathroom, Marcus had glimpsed what looked like a biometric scanner hidden in the woodwork near her study door. Who installed that level of security for administrative government work? Marcus dismissed his concerns as paranoia. He'd run background checks on Eleanor through his usual channels, and everything had come back clean. Eleanor Margaret Whitmore, born in Washington, D.C. in 1953, married to Robert Whitmore in 1978, widowed in 2020. No criminal record, no red flags, just decades of unremarkable government employment, followed by a quiet retirement. What Marcus's surface-level searches couldn't reveal was that Eleanor's entire public history had been carefully constructed by the CIA's identity management team. Her real background, her actual operations, her true capabilities, all of it was buried under layers of classification that wouldn't be declassified for another 50 years. By the 6th week of their relationship, Marcus felt confident enough to escalate. During a romantic evening walk on the beach, he'd stopped Eleanor and taken both her hands in his, looking into her eyes with the perfect mixture of vulnerability and affection he'd practiced countless times. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something," he'd said, his voice slightly rough with manufactured emotion. "I didn't expect this when we met. After Sarah died, I honestly thought I'd never feel this way about anyone again. But you've reminded me what it's like to actually connect with someone, to feel like I have a partner again. I'm falling in love with you, and I needed you to know." Eleanor's eyes had filled with tears. She'd pulled him into an embrace, whispering that she felt the same way, that meeting him had been the first time since Robert's death that she'd felt truly alive again. Marcus had smiled into her shoulder, calculating his next moves. The emotional hook was set. Now came the financial manipulation. The following week, Eleanor invited Marcus to her home for an intimate dinner she'd prepared herself. The evening was perfect. Candlelight, excellent wine, a thoughtfully prepared meal that showed she'd remembered his preferences. After dinner, they moved to her study, a warm room lined with bookshelves and decorated with photographs from her travels. "Marcus," Eleanor said, settling into a leather chair and gesturing for him to sit across from her. "I've been thinking about what you said, about looking over my financial situation. Robert always handled our investments, and honestly, I'm not confident I'm making the right decisions. Would you mind if I showed you some documents? I'd really value your opinion. Marcus's heart raced, but he kept his expression neutral and concerned. Of course, Eleanor. I'm happy to help however I can. Eleanor pulled out a folder from her desk and handed it to Marcus. Inside were bank statements showing multiple accounts with substantial balances, investment portfolios with seven-figure valuations, and property deeds for homes in Montecito, Aspen, and Georgetown. Marcus did quick mental math. Eleanor Whitmore was worth at least $30 million, possibly significantly more. He forced himself to breathe steadily, to maintain the concerned, helpful expression of a devoted partner, rather than a predator who just spotted prey. This was it. This was the score that would set him up for life. Eleanor, this is impressive, Marcus said carefully. Robert clearly did an excellent job building your financial security. But I do see some areas where you might optimize things. If you'd like, I could put together some recommendations. Eleanor smiled gratefully. That would mean the world to me, Marcus. I trust you. Those 3 words, I trust you, were music to Marcus's ears. Trust was the currency he traded in, the foundation of every successful con. Once he had someone's complete trust, taking their money was simply a matter of patience and proper execution. What Marcus didn't see was the micro-camera embedded in the study's crown molding, recording every micro-expression on his face as he'd reviewed Eleanor's financial documents. He didn't notice the nearly invisible fiber-optic cable that transmitted that footage in real time to a federal surveillance van parked 3 blocks away, where agents cataloged every tell that revealed his predatory intent. And he certainly didn't know that the financial documents Eleanor had shown him were carefully crafted fakes, designed to present exactly the right mixture of wealth and vulnerability to trigger a con artist's greed. As Marcus left that evening, promising to compile his financial recommendations over the next few days, Eleanor stood at her door, waving goodbye with a warm smile. The moment his car disappeared down her driveway, her expression changed completely. The sweet, vulnerable widow vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating intelligence operative she'd been for most of her adult life. She walked to her study, opened a hidden panel behind a bookshelf, and pulled out a secure phone. She dialed a number she'd memorized decades ago and waited for the encryption protocol to activate. "It's Nightingale," she said, using her old operational coding name. "The target has taken the bait. He'll make his move within the next 2 weeks. Make sure the team is ready." On the other end of the line, FBI Special Agent David Morrison smiled grimly. "We'll be there, Eleanor. Just be careful. These guys can turn dangerous when they realize they've been caught." Eleanor laughed softly. "David, I've handled terrorists, arms dealers, and Soviet intelligence officers. I think I can manage one small-time con artist." But she checked the slim ceramic blade she kept strapped to her ankle anyway. Old habits died hard, and in her line of work, complacency got you killed. Marcus Chun was about to learn that some prey fought back. What you've witnessed so far is just the setup for one of the most satisfying reversals you'll ever see. What do you think of Eleanor's strategy so far? Do you believe Marcus deserves what's coming to him, or is Eleanor going too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The next chapter reveals the night everything falls apart for Marcus, and trust me, you won't believe how thoroughly Eleanor dismantles him. Marcus Chun spent 4 days crafting what he considered his masterpiece, a comprehensive financial restructuring plan for Eleanor Whitmore that would, if she followed his recommendations, give him access to and eventual control over most of her liquid assets. The plan was elegant in its complexity, sophisticated enough to seem legitimate to someone without financial expertise, but structured in ways that would allow him to slowly siphon funds over the course of several months. The key was a series of recommendations that would consolidate Eleanor's scattered investments into accounts at a boutique investment firm Marcus had used before. The firm was technically legitimate, but its founder owed Marcus favors and asked very few questions. Once Eleanor's money moved into those accounts, Marcus would have access to a series of power of attorney documents disguised as standard investment management paperwork. He'd done this exact scheme 3 times before with variations, and it had never failed. The beauty was that by the time the victim realized money was missing, Marcus would be long gone, probably in Southeast Asia or South America, living comfortably under a new identity. The paper trail would be so convoluted that proving theft would be nearly impossible, especially since his victims would have technically authorized every transaction. On a Thursday evening in late October, Eleanor invited Marcus to her home for what she described as a celebration dinner. She told him she wanted to toast their relationship and discuss his financial recommendations in detail. Marcus arrived at 7 p.m. sharp, carrying flowers and a bottle of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon. Eleanor greeted him at the door, wearing an elegant black dress that made her look 10 years younger. The house was warm and inviting, with soft jazz playing in the background and candles throughout the living room. She'd clearly gone to significant effort, and Marcus felt a momentary pang of something that might have been guilt. Eleanor had been kind to him, genuinely affectionate, and here he was planning to rob her blind. But Marcus had learned long ago to compartmentalize those feelings. These women had more money than they could ever spend. They were lonely because they'd chosen to isolate themselves in their wealth. And if he didn't take their money, someone else would. He was practically doing them a service by being gentler than most con artists. Dinner was exquisite. Eleanor had prepared Chilean sea bass with roasted vegetables and a risotto that rivaled anything Marcus had eaten at 5-star restaurants. They talked about everything and nothing, comfortable in the relationship they'd built over the past 2 months. Marcus felt himself relaxing, enjoying the evening, almost forgetting that this was work. After dinner, they moved to Eleanor's study with coffee and cognac. Marcus pulled out his laptop and began walking Eleanor through his recommendations, explaining each element with the perfect balance of technical competence and accessible language. He watched her face carefully, looking for any signs of suspicion or hesitation. Eleanor asked intelligent questions, but none that suggested she doubted his intentions. She seemed genuinely grateful for his help, even getting slightly emotional as she thanked him for caring enough to put so much work into protecting her financial security. "Marcus, I can't tell you how much this means to me," she said, reaching across the desk to take his hand. "After Robert died, I felt so lost with all of this. Having you here, knowing you care enough to help me navigate something so important, it makes me feel less alone." Marcus squeezed her hand, projecting warmth and devotion while internally calculating his timeline. Another week to get the documents signed, 2 weeks for the transfers to process, then one final romantic weekend before he disappeared forever. 3 weeks to a comfortable retirement. He was so close. "Eleanor, I care about you deeply," Marcus said, the lie sliding smoothly off his tongue after years of practice. "I want to make sure you're protected and secure. You deserve that peace of mind." Eleanor smiled and suggested they move to the living room where they'd be more comfortable. She refreshed their cognac and settled onto the sofa beside Marcus, close enough that their shoulders touched. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, travel plans for the holidays, restaurants they wanted to try together. Then Eleanor asked if Marcus wanted to open the wine he'd brought. He agreed, and she disappeared into the kitchen, returning a few moments later with 2 glasses of the Cabernet. They toasted to new beginnings, to trust, to the future they were building together. Marcus took a long drink of his wine, savoring the rich, complex flavor. It really was an excellent vintage. He'd chosen well. They talked for another 10 minutes, but Marcus began to feel strange. The room seemed slightly off-kilter, his thoughts fuzzy at the edges. He tried to focus on what Eleanor was saying, but her words seemed to come from very far away. "Marcus, are you feeling all right?" Eleanor's voice held concern, but something about her expression didn't match the worry in her tone. "You look pale." Marcus tried to stand, but found his legs wouldn't cooperate. The room tilted dramatically, and he felt himself falling, though it seemed to happen in slow motion. Strong hands caught him before he hit the floor, hands that seemed far too strong to belong to a 72-year-old woman. "Don't fight it," Eleanor's voice said from somewhere above him. "The sedative is fast-acting, but completely harmless. You'll wake up with nothing worse than a headache." Marcus's last conscious thought was confusion. Sedative? What sedative? He'd been so careful. He'd watched Eleanor open the wine bottle, seen her pour both glasses. When had she drugged him? How had she drugged him? Then everything went black. When Marcus opened his eyes, nothing made sense. He wasn't in Eleanor's comfortable living room anymore. He was in a cold, windowless room with concrete walls and harsh fluorescent lighting. He tried to move and discovered his wrists were secured to the arms of a metal chair with professional-grade restraints. His ankles were similarly bound. Panic surged through him, burning away the last effects of whatever Eleanor had given him. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. He was the predator, not the prey. He was in control. A door Marcus hadn't noticed opened, and two men in dark suits entered the room. They carried folders and had the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. Behind them came Eleanor, but she looked completely different. Gone was the sweet, slightly vulnerable widow. Her posture was military straight, her expression coldly professional, her eyes calculating and predatory. "Marcus Jin Chun," one of the men said, settling into a chair across the small table from Marcus. "I'm FBI Special Agent David Morrison. This is Agent Frank Torres. And I believe you've already met Eleanor Whitmore, though perhaps not the real Eleanor Whitmore." Marcus's mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. FBI? Eleanor working with the FBI? Nothing made sense. This had to be some kind of mistake. "I don't know what you think is going on," Marcus said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "But I haven't done anything wrong. Eleanor and I are in a relationship. We were having dinner. I don't know why she drugged me, or why you've restrained me, but this is completely illegal. I want a lawyer right now." Agent Morrison smiled without humor and opened his folder. "You'll get your lawyer, Marcus. But first, I think you should understand exactly how much trouble you're in." He began laying photographs across the table. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he recognized faces from his past. Women he'd conned. 7 different women across 3 states over 5 years. Each one photographed, documented, their statements carefully recorded. "We've been building a case against you for 8 months, Morrison continued. "But you're careful, Marcus. You never take enough to trigger felony theft charges. You structure your cons so the victims technically authorize the transfers. You disappear before they realize they've been robbed. You're good at what you do." Morrison leaned forward, his expression hardening. "But you made one critical mistake. 3 months ago, you targeted a woman named Patricia Harrison in San Diego. Patricia lost her entire retirement savings because of you. $200,000 gone. She tried to file charges, but there wasn't enough evidence. The San Diego police passed the case to us because they suspected it was part of a larger pattern." He tapped one of the photographs, and Marcus's blood ran cold as he recognized Patricia. He'd almost forgotten about her. She'd been easy, trusting, desperate for companionship after her husband's death from cancer. Patricia Harrison was Eleanor Whitmore's college roommate, Morrison said quietly. They'd been best friends for over 50 years. When Eleanor found out what happened, she contacted me. We've worked together before, back when she was still active with the agency. Marcus's eyes shot to Eleanor, who stood calmly by the door, watching him with the detached interest a scientist might show a lab rat. "The agency?" Marcus repeated. "What agency?" "The Central Intelligence Agency," Eleanor said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was different now, harder, with an authority that made Marcus understand he'd never really known her at all. I spent 35 years in covert operations, Marcus. Counterintelligence, infiltration, asset recruitment. I've run operations in 23 countries and helped capture some of the most dangerous criminals in the world. When David asked me to go undercover to gather evidence against you, I agreed immediately. Not just because of what you did to Patricia, but because men like you are predators who need to be stopped. Thank you so much for staying with us this far. The dedication you're showing tells me you're invested in seeing justice served, and I promise you the best is still to come. In the next chapter, we'll reveal exactly how Eleanor executed her perfect counter-operation and what evidence she gathered that will put Marcus away for a very long time. This story is about to reach its most satisfying conclusion, so don't go anywhere. Marcus Chun felt his carefully constructed world disintegrating around him. The woman he'd thought was a vulnerable mark had been a CIA operative who'd hunted international criminals. Every moment of their relationship, every intimate conversation, every touch and smile, had been an elaborate performance designed to trap him. Agent Morrison continued laying out photographs and documents with methodical precision. Bank records showing Marcus's pattern of targeting wealthy widows. Text messages from his phones recovered through search warrants. Testimony from previous victims who'd been located and interviewed. Financial records proving he'd been living far beyond the means of his supposed consulting business. The wine you brought tonight was never opened, Eleanor said, still standing by the door with her arms crossed. I opened a different bottle while you were settling into the study. Same vintage, same year, but from my own collection. The sedative was in your glass, not the wine. I poured it while you were distracted pulling up your laptop presentation. Marcus shook his head in disbelief. You drugged me. That's illegal. Anything you found will be inadmissible in court. Actually, Agent Morrison said with a slight smile, Ms. Whitmore was acting under federal authority as a confidential informant. Every action she took was authorized and supervised by the FBI. The sedative was administered for officer safety during the arrest, which is completely legal. Your lawyer will explain all of this to you, but I can assure you, everything we've done is by the book. Eleanor walked to the table and pulled up a chair, sitting directly across from Marcus. Up close, he could see the cold intelligence in her eyes, the predatory assessment of a hunter who'd cornered dangerous prey countless times before. I want you to understand something, Marcus, Eleanor said quietly. Every word you said to me, every touch, every declaration of love, it was all recorded. Video, audio, biometric data showing your stress responses when you were lying. We have footage of your face when you reviewed my financial documents. And Marcus, you weren't quite as careful with your expressions as you thought. Any decent psychologist will confirm you showed classic predatory indicators. Pupil dilation, micro-expressions of triumph, subtle postural changes. You thought you were fooling me, but I was documenting every second of your performance. Marcus felt sick. Those financial documents you showed me, completely fabricated, Eleanor confirmed. Designed to be just believable enough to trigger your greed, but structured in ways that revealed your true intentions. The moment you started crafting recommendations that would give you control of those accounts, you demonstrated clear criminal intent. Combined with the testimony from your previous victims and the evidence we've gathered about your pattern of behavior, we have more than enough for multiple federal charges. Agent Torres, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. Wire fraud, identity fraud, interstate fraud, money laundering. Each count carries significant prison time, Marcus. We're looking at a potential sentence of 15 to 20 years if you're convicted on all charges. Marcus's mind raced, searching for some angle, some way out. I'll lawyer up. I'll fight every charge. Those women gave me their money willingly. They authorized every transfer, under false pretenses, Morrison countered, using a fabricated identity and manufactured emotional manipulation. That's fraud, Marcus. And this time, We have an airtight case because Eleanor documented everything. She knew exactly what evidence we'd need because she spent decades building cases against criminals far more sophisticated than you. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying Marcus with the clinical detachment of a researcher examining a specimen. "You're actually quite good at what you do," she said. "Your technique is solid, your psychological manipulation sophisticated. You understood how to identify vulnerable targets and exploit their emotional needs. In a different life, with different moral foundations, you might have been an excellent intelligence operative. But you chose to use your talents to hurt people instead of protecting them. And that makes you just another criminal." "Why?" Marcus asked, his voice breaking slightly, despite his efforts to maintain composure. "Why go through all of this for some petty con artist? The FBI has real criminals to catch. Why waste months on me?" Eleanor's expression hardened. "Patricia Harrison was 74 years old when you stole her life savings. She'd worked as a nurse for 47 years, saving every penny she could so she'd have security in retirement. After her husband died, she was lonely and scared, and you exploited that vulnerability without a second thought. The money you took wasn't just numbers in an account, Marcus. It represented decades of hard work, sacrifice, and hope for a peaceful old age." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something dangerous. "Because of you, Patricia can't afford her medications. She's living with her daughter, completely dependent, terrified that she'd become too much of a burden. She cries herself to sleep most nights because she feels stupid and ashamed for being fooled by you. You didn't just steal her money, Marcus. You stole her dignity, her independence, and her sense of safety in the world." Eleanor's eyes were cold and unforgiving. "So yes, I spent 2 months playing the part of your victim. Yes, I let you think you were fooling me. And yes, I took considerable satisfaction in watching you walk straight into a trap you never saw coming. Because men like you need to learn that there are consequences for hurting people, and sometimes those consequences come from places you never expected." The room fell silent. Marcus stared at the table, unable to meet Eleanor's gaze. For the first time in his adult life, he felt genuine shame creeping through the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his conscience. "What happens now?" Marcus asked quietly. "Now," Agent Morrison said, standing and gathering his files, "you'll be processed into federal custody. You'll be appointed a lawyer if you can't afford one, though given the money we've frozen in your accounts, you probably can. You'll have a bail hearing, and then we'll see if you want to take this to trial, or if you're smart enough to cooperate." "Cooperate how?" Marcus asked, looking up with a flicker of hope. "We know you're not working alone," Torres said. "That boutique investment firm you use, the identity documents you've acquired over the years, the offshore accounts we've traced. Someone's providing infrastructure for your operation. If you're willing to give us names, locations, and evidence about the larger network, the prosecutor might be willing to discuss a reduced sentence." Marcus's mind churned through the implications. Testifying against the people who'd helped him meant putting a target on his back in prison. But 20 years versus maybe 5 or 6 years with cooperation, that was a significant difference. "I need to think about it," Marcus said finally. "I need to talk to a lawyer." "That's your right," Morrison agreed. "But Marcus, let me be clear about something. This case against you is airtight. Eleanor's testimony, the recordings, the documentary evidence, the victim statements, we have everything we need for a conviction. Your only question now is whether you want to spend the next 20 years in federal prison, or if you want to help us take down the people who've been enabling criminals like you. Think carefully about which choice serves your interests better." Eleanor stood and walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. She turned back to Marcus one last time. "For what it's worth, Marcus, I don't enjoy this. I don't take pleasure in seeing anyone's life destroyed, even someone who's hurt as many people as you have. But I learned a long time ago that sometimes the only way to protect innocent people is to remove the predators who hunt them. You made your choices. Now you have to live with the consequences." She left the room without looking back. Agent Morrison followed, leaving Torres to begin the formal arrest procedures. As Marcus was read his Miranda rights and processed into custody, his mind kept returning to one moment, Eleanor's face when she talked about Patricia, the genuine anger and protective fury she'd shown when describing her friend's suffering. That emotion had been real in a way nothing else about their relationship had been. Marcus had spent 8 years treating human connection as a tool, a means to financial gain. He'd forgotten, or perhaps never understood, that some people actually cared about each other, that friendship and loyalty could motivate someone to spend months executing a complex, undercover operation just to protect someone they loved. He'd been so focused on Eleanor's vulnerability that he'd never considered her strength, so convinced of her loneliness that he'd never imagined her network of colleagues and friends who'd support her in taking him down, so certain of her naivety that he'd never suspected the decades of training and experience. That made her a far more dangerous operator than he'd ever been. Marcus Chun had spent years hunting what he thought was prey. He'd never realized he was swimming in a pool with apex predators, and he'd just tried to take a bite out of one. The story is nearly at its conclusion, but the final chapter contains the most important revelations of all. What really happened to Marcus? Did Eleanor's operation achieve everything she hoped for? And what became of the victims whose lives Marcus destroyed? Stay with us through to the very end to find out how this story concludes. If you're still watching, it means you're invested in seeing justice served. And that tells me you're exactly the kind of viewer we create content for. Hit that subscribe button and tap the like icon. Don't let the next incredible story pass you by. Comment below. Do you think the justice system works effectively enough to protect vulnerable people from predators like Marcus? And stick around because the finale will show you that sometimes the good guys really do win. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles was packed with spectators for the sentencing hearing of Marcus Jin Chun. The trial had been relatively brief because Marcus, after consulting with 3 different defense attorneys, who all told him the same thing, had accepted a plea deal. In exchange for his cooperation in identifying and testifying against the network of enablers who'd supported his operation, Marcus pled guilty to 12 counts of wire fraud, 4 counts of identity fraud, and 2 counts of money laundering. The recommended sentence, factoring in his cooperation, was 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Eleanor Whitmore sat in the gallery, dressed conservatively in a navy suit, watching as Marcus was led into the courtroom in his orange jumpsuit. He'd lost weight during his months in county jail awaiting trial, and the cocky confidence that had once defined him had been replaced by something that looked almost like humility. Next to Eleanor sat Patricia Harrison, who'd flown in from San Diego for the sentencing. The 2 old friends held hands as the judge reviewed the case details and the terms of the plea agreement. When it came time for victim impact statements, 5 women stood to address the court. They ranged in age from 62 to 79, and each one described how Marcus had manipulated their emotions, stolen their financial security, and left them feeling foolish and violated. Several cried as they spoke. All of them said they hoped the court would ensure Marcus could never hurt anyone else again. Patricia spoke last. She walked slowly to the microphone, her hands shaking slightly, and looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Chun, I want you to know that you didn't just steal my money," Patricia said, her voice quiet but steady. "You stole my confidence in my own judgment. You made me question whether I could trust anyone ever again. For months after you disappeared, I felt like the stupidest person in the world. I blamed myself for being so gullible, so desperate for companionship that I fell for your lies." She paused, gathering herself. "But I've learned something important over these past months. What happened to me wasn't my fault. You're a professional criminal who's been perfecting your techniques for years. I wasn't stupid. I was targeted by a predator who knew exactly how to exploit normal human needs for connection and companionship. Patricia glanced at Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly. I'm also grateful that I have a friend who refused to let you get away with what you did. Eleanor Whitmore is one of the bravest people I've ever known, and she put herself at risk to make sure you faced consequences for your actions. Because of her, I've recovered most of my stolen money. The FBI traced your offshore accounts and seized your assets. It's not everything, but it's enough that I can maintain my independence. She turned back to Marcus. I hope you use your time in prison to think about the real harm you've caused and to become a better person. I don't hate you, Mr. Chun, but I do think you need to be kept away from vulnerable people until you genuinely understand the difference between right and wrong. When Patricia returned to her seat, Eleanor squeezed her hand and whispered something that made Patricia smile through her tears. The judge, a stern woman in her mid-60s who'd clearly been moved by the victim's statements, addressed Marcus directly. Mr. Chun, you've admitted to running a sophisticated criminal operation that targeted some of the most vulnerable members of our society. You exploited the loneliness of widows who'd lost their life partners. You manipulated their emotions with calculated precision. You stole money that represented decades of hard work and careful saving. The harm you've caused extends far beyond the financial losses. You've damaged these women's ability to trust others and to feel safe in their own communities. The judge reviewed the plea agreement terms and the sentencing guidelines. However, I also note that you've cooperated extensively with federal authorities. Your testimony has led to the indictment of 6 individuals involved in providing infrastructure for romance scam operations. Your cooperation has potentially prevented future crimes against other victims. These factors have been considered in the plea agreement before me. She looked directly at Marcus. I hereby sentence you to 8 years in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. During your supervised release, you will be prohibited from using dating apps or websites, from working in any position that involves financial advice or management of other people's money, and from contacting any of your victims. You will also be required to complete psychological counseling focused on developing empathy and understanding the impact of your crimes. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the courtroom. Marcus's shoulders slumped, but he nodded in acceptance. As the bailiffs prepared to escort him out, he turned and looked directly at Eleanor. Their eyes met for a long moment. Marcus appeared to be trying to communicate something regret, perhaps, or acknowledgement, but Eleanor's expression remained neutral and professional. She'd spent 2 months playing a role with him. She had nothing left to say. After the sentencing, Eleanor and Patricia met with Agent Morrison and his team at a nearby cafe. The mood was quietly celebratory, but tinged with the soberness that comes from confronting human cruelty. You did good work, Eleanor, Morrison said, raising his coffee cup in a toast. That testimony Marcus provided has opened up investigations in 3 other states. We're going to shut down a significant piece of the infrastructure that enables these operations. Eleanor nodded, but didn't smile. How many other victims were there that we don't know about? Morrison's expression darkened. Based on Marcus's financial records, we think at least 20 women over the past 8 years, maybe more. Some never reported the crimes because they were embarrassed. Others didn't realize they'd been conned until years later. We're trying to locate as many as we can to inform them about the asset recovery process. Patricia shook her head sadly. 20 women. 20 lives disrupted because one person decided other people's suffering was worth his financial gain. The good news, Agent Torres added, is that Marcus's cooperation is giving us tools to identify other operators using similar techniques. We've already arrested 3 other suspects based on information he provided. This case is going to have ripple effects that extend well beyond Marcus Chun. Later that evening, Eleanor and Patricia sat on Eleanor's terrace in Montecito, watching the sunset paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of orange and gold. They'd opened a bottle of wine and were simply enjoying being together. Two old friends who'd survived a lot over their 7 decades of life. "I still can't believe you went undercover to catch him," Patricia said, shaking her head with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're 72 years old, Eleanor. Couldn't you have just let the FBI handle it?" Eleanor smiled. "Patricia, I've been handling situations far more dangerous than Marcus Chun since before you and I graduated college. One small-time con artist was never going to be a real threat to me." "Still," Patricia insisted, "you risked yourself for me. You spent 2 months pretending to fall in love with that man, letting him think he was manipulating you, all to get evidence for a prosecution." "That's not nothing, Eleanor." Eleanor turned to look at her oldest friend, the woman she'd shared a dorm room with in 1971, the woman who'd been her maid of honor, the woman who'd supported her through Robert's death, and countless other challenges. "You're my sister, Patricia. Not by blood, but by choice. When David called and told me what Marcus had done to you, there was never a question about whether I'd help. The only question was how quickly I could get operational." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what I did to deserve a friend like you." "You were there," Eleanor said simply. "Every time I came back from an assignment I couldn't talk about, feeling like I was carrying the weight of the world, you were there. You never asked questions I couldn't answer. You never judged the parts of my life I had to keep secret. You just loved me and supported me, and that meant everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light fade from the sky. Finally, Patricia spoke again. "Do you think he'll actually change? Marcus, I mean. Do you think 8 years in prison will make him a better person?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I don't know. Change requires genuine remorse and a willingness to do the hard work of becoming different. When I looked at Marcus during the sentencing, I saw someone who was sorry he got caught. But I'm not sure I saw someone who genuinely understood the harm he'd caused. Maybe prison will give him time to reflect and develop that understanding. Or maybe he'll just become a more careful criminal when he gets out." "That's depressing," Patricia observed. "It's realistic," Eleanor countered. "I spent 35 years dealing with criminals, Patricia. Some of them changed. Most of them didn't. But the important thing is that Marcus has been stopped from hurting anyone else for at least 8 years, and he'll be monitored closely after his release. The women he targeted have gotten some measure of justice. That's what matters." Patricia raised her wine glass. "To justice, then, and to friends who refuse to let predators win." Eleanor clinked her glass against Patricia's. "To friendship. The strongest force I know." 3 years later, on a sunny morning in June, Marcus Chun walked out of the Federal Correctional Facility in Lompoc, California, carrying a small bag with his few possessions. He'd served his full 8-year sentence, with time credited for good behavior and participation in educational programs. He was 42 years old, and he'd spent the past 8 years thinking about the choices that had led him to prison. The counseling sessions the judge had mandated had been difficult but transformative. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus had been forced to confront the real human cost of his crimes, not as abstract concepts, but as actual people whose lives he'd damaged. One of the requirements of his supervised release was that he find legitimate employment and check in weekly with his parole officer. Marcus had earned certifications in computer programming during his incarceration, and he'd lined up a job with a tech company in San Jose that specialized in hiring people with criminal records who were trying to rebuild their lives. He'd also been required to write letters of apology to all his identified victims. The process had been excruciating, forcing him to articulate exactly what he'd done and acknowledge the harm he'd caused. Most of the women never responded, which Marcus understood. Patricia Harrison had written back, though, a brief note that simply said she hoped he'd become the kind of person who contributed positively to the world instead of taking from it. Marcus had that letter in his pocket now, as he waited for the shuttle that would take him to the bus station. He pulled it out and read it for probably the 100th time, focusing on Patricia's final sentence. You can't change your past, but you can choose your future. Choose wisely. He thought about Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who'd outsmarted him so completely that it had taken him months to fully process what had happened. He'd replayed their time together countless times in his mind, analyzing every moment, trying to understand how he'd been so thoroughly fooled. The answer, he'd eventually realized, was that Eleanor hadn't been playing a character. She'd been herself intelligent, capable, strong, but she'd allowed Marcus to see only the parts of herself that fit his expectations of who she should be. He'd been so convinced he understood her that he'd missed all the signs that she was something far more formidable than he'd imagined. It was a lesson Marcus carried with him now. Never underestimate people. Never assume you're the smartest person in the room. Never treat other human beings as objects to be manipulated for personal gain. He'd learned those lessons the hardest way possible, but he'd learned them. The shuttle arrived, and Marcus climbed aboard for the first leg of his journey to a new life. He didn't know if he'd be successful at staying on the right side of the law. He didn't know if the skills he'd developed in prison would translate to legitimate success. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He never wanted to end up in a cold interrogation room across from someone like Eleanor Whitmore ever again. As for Eleanor, she continued her peaceful retirement in Montecito, traveling when the mood struck her, spending time with friends like Patricia, and occasionally consulting on cases when old colleagues from the bureau or the agency needed someone with her particular skill set. She never spoke publicly about her role in Marcus Chaun's capture. That wasn't her style. She'd spent most of her life working in the shadows, and she was comfortable there. The satisfaction she felt came not from public recognition, but from knowing she protected her friend and potentially prevented other women from becoming victims. On quiet evenings, Eleanor would sometimes sit on her terrace with a glass of wine, watching the sunset and reflecting on the strange trajectory of her life. She'd started as an idealistic young woman who wanted to make the world safer. She'd become a hardened operative who'd seen humanity at its worst and its best. And she'd ended up as an apparently sweet retiree who could still take down criminals when necessary. She'd lived 3 distinct lives, and somehow they'd all been authentic versions of herself. The young idealist, the dangerous operative, and the peaceful retiree coexisted within her, ready to emerge depending on what the situation required. Eleanor Whitmore had learned long ago that people contained multitudes, that the sweet grandmother and the deadly spy could be the same person, that strength and gentleness weren't opposites, but complementary aspects of a complete human being. And she'd learned that sometimes the most effective way to catch a predator was to let them think they'd found easy prey, right up until the moment the trap snapped shut. It was a lesson Marcus Chaun would carry with him for the rest of his life. And there you have it, a story about justice, redemption, and the reminder that we should never judge people by their appearance or make assumptions about what they're capable of. The sweet elderly lady turned out to be one of the most formidable opponents Marcus had ever faced, and his attempt to exploit her kindness led to the complete dismantling of his criminal operation. What did you think of this story? Have you ever encountered someone whose real capabilities surprised you completely? We want to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us your name, what city and state you're watching from, and what you thought about Eleanor's brilliant counter-operation against Marcus. Did justice prevail the way it should have? Was the sentence fair? Let us know your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss another incredible tale of unexpected twists and justice served. Hit that like button to help others discover this story, and share it with friends who appreciate narratives about clever people outsmarting criminals. And don't go anywhere yet. Check out the next video recommendation appearing on your screen right now. We have more amazing stories about unlikely heroes, shocking revelations, and the extraordinary people hiding in plain sight all around us. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we'll see you in the next story.